Mason Reed paid $2,000 for a garage that had a rusted tin roof, cracked concrete floors, and a weathered sign no one could read anymore. His neighbors called him a fool. The bank had turned him down twice. The woman who had fired him 4 years earlier, now the CEO of the largest auto empire in the state, laughed quietly when she heard the news. But Mason Reed had not purchased a garage. He had purchased something no one around him could see yet: the right to start over entirely on his own terms. And within 3 years, that $2,000 garage would force Giselle Harmon to revalue everything she believed she controlled. Don't look away. This is the kind of story that changes how you see every starting point you have ever written off. The morning was the color of February in Detroit: gray sky, gray road, gray air that pressed against the skin like wet cloth. Mason Reed stood on the sidewalk in front of 14 Colton Street, his breath making small white clouds that disappeared before they could mean anything. The building was a single-story industrial structure that had not been used since the financial crisis of 2008. The tin roof had patches of rust the size of dinner plates. The roll-up steel door had been welded shut from the outside. Someone had spray-painted the word "closed" across it in letters that were now fading into the metal, and a thin crust of ice had formed along the threshold where snowmelt had refrozen overnight. The window above the side door was boarded with plywood gone dark with weather. Isaac Doyle stood next to Mason holding a paper cup of gas station coffee, staring at the building and then at the wrinkled bill of sale in Mason's hand, and then at the building again. "You just bought yourself a cement tomb," Isaac said. Mason did not answer. He put the key in the side door, turned it, and stepped inside. The interior smelled like old oil and cold metal, and the particular staleness of air sealed in for too long. 3 rusted lift racks stood in a row along the back wall. The overhead fluorescent fixtures had no bulbs, and a workbench along the left side was buried under a layer of grime so thick it looked painted on. In the far corner, angled slightly toward the wall, as though it had given up trying to go anywhere, sat a 1994 Ford F-150 with all 4 tires flat and the hood propped open. The previous owner had left it behind without explanation, the same way you leave a piece of furniture too heavy to move. Mason walked the length of the floor slowly, his boots making hollow sounds on the concrete, and he did not look like a man taking inventory. He looked like a man listening. He stopped at the Ford, pulled a flashlight from his jacket pocket, and aimed the beam into the engine bay. The beam moved in slow arcs, pausing at the intake manifold, the fuel rail, the injector housings, and Isaac watched from the doorway, drinking his coffee. 30 seconds passed in silence. Then Mason clicked the flashlight off and slid it back into his pocket. "It wants to run," he said. Isaac looked at him for a moment. Then, "You need help with the roof." It was not a question. Mason nodded once, and that was the beginning of it. He had made no announcement. He had filed no press release, posted no opening notice, and told no one in the industry where he was going or what he intended to do. $2,000 in cash, paid to a tired man who owed back taxes on a property he no longer had any use for, and no one in Detroit's automotive world had taken any notice. That was exactly the way Mason wanted it. To understand what Mason Reed was doing on Colton Street that February morning, you had to go back 7 years to a period when he was not a man buying ruined buildings with the last of his savings, but a senior engineer at Caldwell Precision Motors, one of the most technically respected automotive components firms in the Midwest. Caldwell supplied precision-engineered parts to 3 major manufacturers, and Mason led the team responsible for developing a new generation of fuel delivery systems, the kind of work that fills patents and shapes the direction of an entire product line for a decade. He had a reputation among engineers for a particular kind of intelligence, the ability to hear a running engine the way a doctor hears a heartbeat, to identify not just what was wrong but why, and to trace a symptom back to its root cause through mechanical logic rather than guesswork. Over 7 years, he became the kind of engineer that a company builds its future around quietly, without ceremony, the way load-bearing walls work. His wife's name had been Ellen. She was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer on a Tuesday in March and was gone by the following November. Mason took extended leave from Caldwell during that period, first to care for her, then to survive the aftermath of her absence. When he requested a formal return to his position, The meeting that followed was not the reunion he had expected. The woman on the other side of the conference table was 30 years old, recently promoted to Director of Human Resources, and she read his performance evaluation in a tone suggesting she was reciting from a document she had not personally prepared. Her name was Giselle Harmon. She pushed a sealed envelope across the polished table without making eye contact and said, in a voice free of all inflection, "We need people who can commit fully to the position. Your circumstances no longer align with what the role requires." Mason sat with that for a moment. Then he took the envelope, stood up, and walked out. What he did not know, what Isaac would tell him years later, when the wound had calcified enough to examine, was that the fuel delivery patent his team had developed during his tenure was sold by Caldwell to 2 major manufacturers for a combined figure with 8 digits, and Mason's name did not appear on the licensing agreement. Under the terms of his employment contract, inventions developed during paid working hours belonged to the company. It was standard language in a standard contract, the kind of clause no one reads carefully until it is too late. The salary of the woman who had handed him his termination letter was funded, in part, by the technology his mind had built. He had understood that on some level from the moment he walked out of that conference room, he had simply chosen not to let it become the thing that defined him. For 4 years after Caldwell, Mason worked independently diagnostic consulting for small repair operations, short-term contracts for specialty rebuilds, the kind of work that kept him solvent without requiring him to sign his name to another corporation's ambitions. He turned down 2 legitimate job offers from reputable firms with competitive salaries, and the people who knew him well understood why. The people who did not know him simply concluded that he was done. $2,000 was what remained after 4 years of careful, methodical saving, not because he had spent recklessly, but because independent work at his level did not pay the way a senior engineering salary had. He had been waiting for the right thing to spend it on. The Ford F-150 took Mason 2 weeks to diagnose properly. The problem was not mechanical in the obvious sense. The engine itself had no catastrophic damage. What it had was a fuel system slowly destroyed from the inside by years of sitting with degraded fuel in the lines. Varnish deposits had built up across the injector tips, the fuel pressure regulator had seized, and the pump had corroded to near failure. The standard repair approach would have been replacement. New pump, new injectors, new regulator, total cost somewhere above $1,200 in parts alone. Mason took a different route. He spent 3 days designing a cleaning and recalibration procedure, using modified components he machined himself from stock materials, and the total cost came to $140. When the engine turned over on a gray Thursday morning, in the 3rd week of February, Isaac was sitting on an overturned bucket with a wrench in his hand and did not move for several seconds. "You built a new part out of an old part," he said finally. Mason wiped his hands on a shop rag. "I modified existing geometry to match the required tolerance." "It is the same thing." Isaac stared at the running engine. "No," he said, "it is not." The garage repairs proceeded through March. New roofing panels installed on weekends with Isaac's help, the electrical system rewired from the junction box out, the fluorescent fixtures replaced with LED work lights, the lift racks cleaned and tested and certified to load capacity. Mason sourced most of the replacement materials from salvage and surplus suppliers. The same approach he had applied to the Ford, not because the cost of new materials was beyond him, but because working with what existed rather than what was ideal was a discipline he had practiced so long it had become instinct. He rewired the main panel on a Saturday, with wind pressing through the gaps in the metal siding, his breath visible in the cold air, and when he threw the breaker and the LED fixtures came on in sequence down the length of the bay, he stood for a moment and let the light settle into the corners. Isaac, watching from the doorway, said nothing. Some things did not require commentary. Mason did the majority of the work himself, not because he could not afford to hire help, but because each repaired system was a kind of proof to no one in particular, or perhaps to himself. By April, the space was functional. By May, it had a name, Reed Mechanical, rendered in hand, lettered paint on a piece of pine board mounted above the roll-up door. No logo, no vinyl wrap, no illuminated signage. A name and a door, which was sufficient. The first paying customer came through Isaac, a man named Levi, who ran a small masonry operation out of a single truck and could not afford the downtime that a dealership service appointment required. The transmission on his work truck had been slipping for weeks, and 2 shops had quoted repairs in the range of $3,000. Mason examined the transmission in an afternoon, identified a worn selector fork causing the symptom, and replaced the component in 4 hours. He charged Levi 1/3 of what the other shops had estimated. Levi told 2 friends, the friends told others, and by the end of summer, Mason had a steady rotation of a dozen regular clients: tradesmen, independent truckers, small fleet operators, people who needed vehicles, kept running on budgets that larger shops did not respect. None of them were wealthy. All of them paid on time and came back. 6 months after the hand-lettered sign went up, Reed Mechanical had expanded to 2 service bays. Mason had hired 2 additional technicians, both former dealership mechanics cut in the last round of corporate restructuring, and the shop had begun taking in classic vehicle restoration work, a segment that larger operations avoided because of the labor intensity and the low margin on standardized parts. The restorations brought a different kind of client: collectors and enthusiasts willing to pay for precision over speed, willing to drive from Ohio and Indiana, when word spread that the man on Colton Street could do things with an old engine that most technicians no longer knew how to attempt. Mason did not advertise. He did not need to. The Porsche arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered on a flatbed by a man in his early 40s, who introduced himself as Jackson and said almost nothing about where he had heard of the shop. The vehicle was a 2019 911 with a dual-clutch transmission that had already been through 2 authorized service centers, both of which had quoted the same diagnosis: complete transmission replacement, $14,000, 6-week lead time on the gearbox. Jackson said the second center had told him the car was essentially uneconomical to repair and suggested he sell it. He had a particular expression when he said this, not quite anger, more like the resigned frustration of someone who has been told a familiar lie and knows it is a lie but cannot prove it yet. Mason listened without comment, walked around the car once, and then asked Jackson to wait. The diagnosis took 48 hours. What Mason found was not a failed transmission. It was a software calibration drift in the transmission control module, compounded by microscopic wear in 2 clutch pack surfaces caused by a driving pattern the control software had been incorrectly managing for months. The unit did not need to be replaced. It needed the control module reflashed with corrected parameters and the clutch surfaces measured and shimmed to compensate for the wear profile. Total parts cost: less than $100. Total labor: 11 hours. Mason called Jackson on the morning of the 3rd day and gave him a figure less than 1/10 of what the authorized centers had quoted. Jackson was quiet on the phone for a moment, then asked how Mason had found it. Mason explained in the specific language of transmission engineering, with no translation offered or felt necessary. Jackson listened to the entire explanation without interrupting. He came to pick up the car that afternoon, drove it around the block twice, and then sat in it in front of the shop for a long minute before getting out. Jackson's last name was Harmon. He was the older brother of Giselle Harmon, CEO of Harmon Prestige Auto Group, the largest luxury dealership network in Michigan. He told her about Reed Mechanical that same evening, gave her the address, the technician's name, and the story of the Porsche. Giselle sat with that information longer than she let show. Mason Reed was a name she remembered not with guilt, which was not an emotion she moved through easily, but with the specific alertness of someone who has made a decision they were confident about, and is now encountering evidence that the confidence may have been premature. She drove past 14 Colton Street the following morning without stopping. She sat at the wheel and looked at the hand-lettered sign, and the 2 bays visible through the open roll-up door, and the man in a gray work shirt bent under the hood of a vehicle, and she sat there for perhaps 90 seconds. Then she called Charlotte Webb, her director of operations, and said, "Find out everything about that shop." Charlotte Webb arrived on a Wednesday. Driving a Maserati with a gearbox complaint she described in terms suggesting mechanical unfamiliarity, which was accurate. She presented herself as a private owner, paid cash for the diagnostic fee, and left the vehicle. Over the following 2 days, while Mason and his technicians worked on the car. Charlotte moved through the shop with the controlled curiosity of someone conducting an audit. She spoke to both technicians, studied the equipment, and photographed the software diagnostic rig that Mason had built from modified commercial hardware. She asked questions about workflow and turnaround time, in the manner of a person genuinely interested in process efficiency, which she was just not for the reasons she implied. When she collected the vehicle and Mason walked her through the repair summary, she asked a final question. "Do you hold any licensing agreements for the diagnostic methodology you use here?" Mason told her it was proprietary. She thanked him and left. 11 days later, a legal letter arrived at Reed Mechanical from the firm representing Harman Prestige Auto Group. The letter asserted that the computer-assisted diagnostic and recalibration technique currently being employed at Reed Mechanical constituted unauthorized use of methods protected under a patent portfolio that Harman Prestige had acquired from Caldwell Precision Motors 18 months earlier. The letter demanded that Mason cease all use of the described methodology immediately and requested a meeting with legal counsel within 21 days. Mason read the letter twice at his workbench, folded it in thirds, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he called Isaac. Isaac listened without speaking, and when Mason finished, there was a pause before Isaac said, "They bought the patent your hands built, and now they are using it to lock your hands." Mason said he needed to make another call. He dialed Diana Caldwell. Diana Caldwell was 52, a solo practice intellectual property attorney whose career had been built on the kind of contract work that corporations outsource to reduce conflict of interest risk. She had reviewed a portion of Mason's employment contract at Caldwell Precision years earlier during an independent legal engagement, and she remembered him for the same reason anyone who had encountered him professionally tended to. He was the kind of engineer who asked questions about contract language that engineers rarely think to ask. When Mason explained the letter, she was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she told him to come to her office immediately. The file Diana laid out on the conference table that afternoon had been in storage for 6 years. It was a retained copy of Mason's original employment agreement with Caldwell Precision, along with a secondary document that most people in Mason's position would never have thought to produce. A technical concept log, time-stamped in the Caldwell internal system 47 days before the formal project approval date for the Fuel Delivery Development Initiative that had ultimately produced the contested patent. The concept log was Mason's habit carried over from graduate school, a record of ideas in early form, not polished, not formal, but time-stamped and stored in the company's own system, which gave it a particular evidentiary weight that a private notebook would not have had. Diana explained the legal architecture carefully. The patent that Harman Prestige had acquired covered the commercialized version of the technology the iteration developed, tested, and brought to market during Mason's paid tenure. Under standard employment contract law, that version belonged to Caldwell and had been sold legitimately, but the concept log predated the formal project by 47 days. The original methodology, the foundational logic the commercialized version had been built upon, was documented as Mason's individual intellectual development prior to the formal work assignment, and if that prior development could be established under the prior conception doctrine, the scope of what Harman Prestige actually owned became significantly narrower than their letter had implied. The methodology Mason was using at Reed Mechanical was not the commercialized version. It was a practical application of the original concept, modified and adapted through independent work. What made the situation more serious than a simple scope dispute was what Diana had found in the patent filings. Harman Prestige had submitted an application for a retroactive scope extension that, if granted, would expand the patent's coverage to include the foundational methodology itself. The application was in review. There were 6 weeks before a decision would be issued. If the extension was granted, Mason would be legally prohibited from practicing his core diagnostic technique, and the restriction would apply nationally. Diana placed the filing documents in front of him and said plainly that fighting Harman Prestige's legal team was an extended engagement. They had resources that took time to exhaust. She also said something that she framed carefully, because she was a precise person who chose her words as deliberately as Mason chose his tools. The timing of Harman Prestige's scope extension filing was not coincidental. The application had been submitted 4 days after Charlotte Webb's visit to the shop. Someone at Harman Prestige had looked at what Mason was doing, recognized the technical lineage, and moved to close the legal territory before Mason had any opportunity to act. It was the kind of move that required both technical understanding and legal foresight, and it told Diana something about who had authorized it. She did not say Giselle's name. She did not need to. Mason sat across from her for a moment, without speaking. Outside the window, the afternoon light had gone flat and gray in the way that Detroit afternoons go flat in late autumn, as though the city was conserving something. Then he asked Diana what they needed to do in the next 6 weeks. She told him. Mason did not file an emergency injunction. He did not make public statements. He worked. Over the following 6 weeks, he ran 3 efforts simultaneously with a kind of focused parallel execution that had made him effective as an engineer. Not a man who fixed one thing and then moved to the next, but a man who understood how systems interact and could hold multiple tracks in his mind without losing the thread of any of them. The first track was legal. Working with Diana, he assembled a formal challenge to Harman Prestige's scope extension application. The original concept log, with its Caldwell system timestamps, a technical declaration from Mason explaining the developmental timeline in precise engineering terms, and a signed witness statement from Isaac Doyle, confirming that he had read the concept log and the Caldwell internal system on the date it was timestamped, and had discussed its contents with Mason in a meeting that Isaac had documented in his own archived project notes. Diana filed the submission with the Patent Office on a Thursday with 17 days to spare before the review deadline. The second track was operational. Reed Mechanical signed 6-month service contracts with 2 mid-sized commercial fleet operators in Michigan and northern Ohio, a courier logistics company and a regional construction equipment firm, both of whom needed ongoing maintenance programs for mixed fleets that no luxury dealership would touch. Whatever happened with the patent challenge, the shop could run. The third track was the one Isaac called the unexpected move. Mason reached out through a shared professional contact in the German automotive supply chain to 2 independent components manufacturers seeking American testing and validation partners, a German firm specializing in high-precision valve assemblies and a Japanese firm developing a new generation of hybrid drivetrain components. Both had been frustrated by their inability to find American partners who were technically credible, operationally independent, and not already contractually aligned with the major manufacturers. Mason offered Reed Mechanical as a fee-based independent evaluation facility, a shop that could test components in real working conditions without the bias of an existing commercial relationship. Both firms expressed serious interest within the first 2 weeks. None of those conversations had anything to do with Harman Prestige, or the patent challenge, or anything Giselle Harman had set in motion. They were simply the work of a man who understood that the best defense against pressure from one direction is to build strength from another. Logan Harman watched all of this from a distance. He was 71, retired in the formal sense, which meant he no longer attended board meetings but still received briefings from Jackson, who remained closely connected to his father in the way that older sons of self-made men often do. When Jackson described what Mason had done with the Porsche, Logan had asked one question. Did he explain how he found it? Jackson said yes. Logan said, "Find out more about him." When the patent situation developed and the legal filings were exchanged, Logan read the documentation that Jackson forwarded. He drove past 14 Colton Street on a Saturday afternoon in his own truck, a 2012 Silverado. He preferred for no reason he had ever articulated. He sat outside the shop for a few minutes, watching a man in a gray shirt work under the raised hood of a late-model SUV. Then he drove away without stopping. Harman Prestige had not anticipated that Mason would respond to legal pressure by accelerating rather than retreating, and when Charlotte's next operational report described the fleet contracts and the foreign manufacturer conversations, Giselle moved to a second layer of pressure. The approach was indirect. Harman Prestige reached out to 3 parts suppliers that had been providing Mason with components on favorable terms and made it clear, without explicit threat, that a continuing commercial relationship with Reed Mechanical might complicate their standing as preferred suppliers in Harman's network. Two of the three terminated their arrangements with the shop within 10 days. For 2 weeks, Mason's technicians managed around a parts shortage that required rescheduling 4 jobs and delaying delivery on 2 others. The clients whose jobs were delayed were given full explanations and offered partial refunds, and 3 of the 4 accepted without leaving. During the same period, an anonymous account on a regional automotive forum published a post claiming that Reed Mechanical had been found using non-certified components on customer vehicles. The post cited no specific incident, named no specific vehicle, and referenced no documentation. Isaac tracked the post's origin to a registered IP address associated with a serviced office building in Detroit's Midtown Business District, in a suite that Charlotte Webb held under a secondary business entity. He sent Mason the information in a text message without comment. What happened in the following 48 hours had not been organized or requested by Mason. 11 clients posted responses to the thread from their own accounts, describing their specific vehicles, the repairs performed, and the results. A long-haul truck driver named Wyatt, who had brought 3 separate vehicles to Reed Mechanical over the previous 18 months, wrote a response that circulated widely across the forum. "I have driven over 400,000 miles in commercial vehicles. I know what a bad repair feels like inside a cab. If that shop had used inferior parts on my truck, I would have known it on the first highway run. I have not." The thread was archived by the forum moderator after it became clear the original post lacked substantiation. Mason never commented publicly. He did not need to. One evening near the end of that difficult stretch, after his technicians had gone home and the shop was quiet, Mason sat on the front bumper of the Ford F-150 repaired now, used occasionally for parts pickups, and looked at the interior of the building around him. The concrete floor still held the original oil staining from the previous occupant, overlaid now by the newer patterns of Reed Mechanical's own work. The tools on the wall racks had been arranged according to a system he had developed himself. He had built every operational element of this place with his own hands, his own money, and his own judgment. He sat with that for a while in the quiet. The hearing before the Patent Review Board was scheduled for a Thursday in December. Diana presented Mason's challenge documentation to a 3-person panel in a federal building in downtown Detroit, while Harman Prestige's legal team occupied the opposite table. There were 4 attorneys on Harman's side. Diana had brought Isaac as her technical witness and a supplementary declaration from one of the German manufacturer's engineers who had reviewed Mason's methodology and submitted a professional assessment that it constituted an independent and distinct approach from the commercialized version in the contested patent. The hearing room was quiet and fluorescent and smelled faintly of old carpet, the way federal buildings tend to smell, and the 3 panelists listened with the attentive neutrality of people whose professional function is to evaluate evidence rather than argue for outcomes. The Harman attorneys challenged the authenticity of the timestamp documentation on the grounds that internal company system logs were not independently verifiable, argued that the prior conception doctrine had narrow application in employment context patents, and presented their own expert, a patent consultant, who testified that the methodology gap between the original concept and the commercialized version was insufficient to establish separately protectable prior invention. Diana's response to the timestamp challenge was a document she had held in reserve, a backup copy of the Caldwell Internal System Archive from the relevant period, obtained through a data preservation request filed with Caldwell's bankruptcy receiver 18 months earlier when the company was dissolved. The archive was independently certified. It confirmed the timestamp without reliance on Mason's own records, and Isaac's testimony confirmed the same date through independent recollection, supported by his own archived project notes. The panel's ruling was issued 6 days later in writing. Harman Prestige's application for retroactive scope extension was denied. The stated grounds were insufficient clarity of prior developmental chain to support retroactive coverage expansion. The ruling did not invalidate the existing patent. It did not award Mason any rights. It simply declined to extend Harman Prestige's coverage into the territory they had claimed, and Reed Mechanical could continue operating. The methodology Mason had developed and was practicing at the shop remained outside the scope of the patent as it stood. It was not a triumph. It was a door that stayed open, Giselle left the building after the ruling with Charlotte beside her and said nothing during the elevator ride or the walk to the car. She had not lost a case she should have won. She had lost an expansion she had pursued without adequate preparation, and the distinction mattered to her. As her driver pulled into traffic, she sat with the specific quality of silence that belongs to a person recalculating from a new position. Logan Harmon appeared at Reed Mechanical on a Thursday afternoon in January without an appointment. He came in the Silverado and parked it along the side of the building rather than in front, where the client spaces were. He was wearing a flannel shirt and work pants, and he looked like what he was, a man who had spent the formative decades of his adult life in spaces that smelled like the one he had just walked into. Mason was under the rear axle of a fleet van when Isaac signaled him. Mason rolled out, stood up, and looked at Logan for a moment. Then he walked to the small refrigerator in the corner, took out 2 cans of soda, and held one out. Logan took it. They stood near the Ford F-150, and the conversation began the way 2 men who spent their lives around engines tend to begin conversations, with the vehicle nearest to hand. Logan looked at the truck and asked about the repair work it had been through. Mason described the fuel system reconstruction. Logan asked 2 technical follow-up questions that indicated he understood exactly what the modification involved. Then, without preamble, he said, "I started from a single bay in Flint in 1979. No investors, no family money. I know what this building means." Mason looked at him without speaking. Logan continued. He told Mason what Mason did not know, that during the years Mason had been working at Caldwell Precision, Logan had held a minority investment position in the company. He had seen Mason's work product from a distance, the patent development, the technical output, the record of what the fuel delivery team had produced under Mason's direction. When the situation around Mason's departure developed, Logan had raised objections internally on the grounds that the handling was legally and ethically irregular. He had not had sufficient control in the shareholder structure to alter the outcome. He said this plainly, without self-justification, and then stopped. Mason asked, "Why are you telling me this now?" Logan said, "Because I've been watching what you have built here for 8 months, and I want to ask you a direct question before I lose the chance." He laid out what he had in mind. Harmon Prestige had the largest commercial fleet service contract network in Michigan and served institutional clients, municipal agencies, hospital systems, regional logistics companies who needed specialized technical services that no dealership service department was structured to provide. Harmon had the contracts and the client relationships, but not the technical depth. Reed Mechanical had the technical depth and the operational credibility, but not the distribution scale. Not a merger, not an acquisition, a formal service referral arrangement under which Harmon Prestige would direct its specialized and fleet segment clients to Reed Mechanical on a contractual basis, with Reed Mechanical operating fully independently. No equity exchange, no operational oversight, no approval chains. Logan said he had not discussed it with Giselle. He told Mason this without apparent concern about the omission. Mason was quiet for what felt to both of them like a long time. He looked at the garage around him, the tools, the lifts, the floor that still carried 20 years of other people's oil in its grain. He thought about the question the way he thought about any diagnostic problem, not from the emotion of it, but from the structure of it. What Logan was describing was not an alliance. It was not a rescue. It was a commercial arrangement between 2 entities that each had something the other lacked, and the fact that the families behind those entities had history did not change the business logic of what was being proposed. Mason had built Reed Mechanical without any institutional support, and he would continue building it in that direction regardless of what he decided in the next few days. The question was not whether he needed Logan Harmon. The question was whether the arrangement served the shop and the people who depended on it. He told Logan he would think about it and would call him by the end of the week. Logan nodded, set the empty soda can on the workbench, and walked to the Silverado. Mason watched the truck until it turned off Colton Street. Then he picked up his wrench and went back to work. 2 years later, Reed Mechanical had become Reed Precision Group. 3 facilities in Michigan and Ohio, 27 employees, and active evaluation contracts with 2 European and 1 Japanese components manufacturer, each of whom used the Detroit facility as their primary American independent testing site. The expansion had not been planned as a growth strategy in any formal sense. There had been no business plan revision, no investor deck, no milestone targets written on a whiteboard. Each new facility had opened because the demand was there and the technical staff to run it were available, and Mason had evaluated each decision the way he evaluated everything, by the specifics in front of him, rather than by a framework built in advance. The second facility in Ohio came about because one of the fleet operators on the service contract had relocated its primary depot across the state line and needed on-site support, and the third came about because the German components firm wanted a dedicated testing bay closer to their distribution hub in Cleveland. The growth was not a statement, it was a consequence. The original shop on Colton Street remained operational and remained the central facility. The hand-lettered pine sign still hung above the roll-up door, alongside a machined steel plate with the new name. The concrete floor still held the original oil staining in its deeper grain. Mason had not replaced the floor. He had considered it once, and then decided against it. The referral arrangement with Harmon Prestige had been finalized through legal negotiation 6 weeks after Logan's visit. Giselle had reviewed the contract in her capacity as CEO, amended 2 clauses through her legal team, and signed it. She and Mason had not spoken directly during the negotiation. The arrangement generated roughly 30% of Reed Precision's revenue in its first year and 15% in the second, as Mason's other streams expanded. It was a commercial relationship professional, clearly bounded, productive for both parties. Nothing more than that, and nothing less. The conversation that did happen between Giselle and Mason occurred at an automotive industry conference in Detroit in the second spring after the patent ruling. At a reception that both had reason to attend, Giselle crossed the room to where Mason was standing. She stood in front of him and said, after a moment, "I did not think you would be able to do what you have done here." Mason waited. She continued, "I mean that I genuinely believed you would not be able to do it." A brief pause followed in which neither of them spoke. Then she said, "I was wrong." She did not frame it as an apology. It was a statement of corrected assessment from a person for whom that kind of correction was neither comfortable nor common. Mason looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I know." Giselle held his gaze briefly, then turned and walked back into the reception. Mason watched her go, then turned back to the conversation he had been in. Isaac heard the story later that evening, when they were sitting in the original bay on Colton Street, with the roll-up door halfway up and the night air coming in cold and carrying the smell of the city. Isaac had brought 2 beers and was sitting in the chair he kept at the shop for exactly this purpose. He asked, "Was that enough?" Mason thought about the question seriously, the way he thought about things that deserved a serious answer. Then he said, "It is accurate. That is enough." Isaac leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The shop was quiet except for the sound of the street and the faint tick of cooling metal from the last vehicle of the day. What Mason Reed had built was not a monument to resilience or a rebuke to anyone who had underestimated him. It was a functioning operation, built on genuine technical knowledge, sustained by the trust of people who needed work done well, and developed according to a logic that had never required anyone else's permission. The $2,000 building was not a symbol. It was a decision, the last decision available to him at a particular moment, made without drama and without certainty, and followed through with the same consistency that an engine requires to run. The right fuel, the right tolerances, the right attention, day after day after day. There is a kind of knowledge that accumulates in hands and in judgment over years of real work knowledge that cannot be transferred in a termination letter and cannot be purchased through a patent acquisition and cannot be replicated by a legal team, no matter how well funded. Mason Reed had always known this. He had simply needed a building to put it in.